In my over a decade of experience with budgeting for myself and helping others, I've come across a myriad of reasons, excuses, fears, and inaccurate rationalizations for why people choose not to budget. And it's doing more harm than good. There was a point in time when I chose not to budget, and it cost me a lot. Thankfully, I got my act together, and now I help women do the same. We all need to be budgeting. And if you've convinced yourself otherwise, I am here to set you straight. In this episode, I'm sharing 5 budgeting myths millennial women, or really any woman or person, needs to stop believing because these myths are delaying a life of happiness. Now, before I get into the budgeting myths, I want to touch on the importance of budgeting your money. Regardless of how much or how little you make, budgeting will help you figure out how to manage what you do have. Budgeting will allow you to allocate your income to your necessary expenses and spending areas. Budgeting will show you if you should have a profit left over each month, but you find yourself living paycheck to paycheck. And budgeting will show you how you can actually allocate any profit you do have to improving your situation. Now, I actually have an entire episode dedicated to helping people shift the negative mindset they may have with budgeting. It's called Breaking Through the Stigma of Budgeting. It's CGS podcast episode number 3. I'm going to link to that in the show notes, especially if you find yourself struggling with accepting a budget as a good thing. Okay, let's get into the 5 budgeting myths to stop believing as soon as possible. Myth number 1, I can create a budget in my head. Let me ask you something. How's that budget in your head working out for you? And be honest. Sure, you may have a general idea of what you spend, but is it really working? This idea that I can create a budget in my head sounds easy, sounds doable, but it really isn't. So let's break it down for a second. When you rely on a mental budget or keeping your budget in your head, you're leaving so much room for error. Just think about it. How often do unexpected expenses pop up? Or maybe it's those irregular one-off costs like annual subscriptions or that last-minute gift you need for a friend's birthday. Anytime something like that pops up, you are opening the door for financial problems. What about when you overspend? How do you compensate for that quickly in your head? It's just too easy for something to go wrong when it's all in your head. It's very hard to course correct and analyze what can be done differently moving forward with your budget and spending for the month when it's all in your head. Plus, wouldn't you rather save your mental headspace for more important things? Not that your budget isn't important, but there are ways to budget without leveraging so much mental headspace. I think instead of worrying about how to remember every single expense you have, you could focus on enjoying life or working towards your goals. Here's the thing. Budgeting doesn't have to live in your head, and it shouldn't. Grab a notebook, create a spreadsheet, or even download a budgeting app. Start with writing everything down. Not only will you have a clear plan, but you will feel a lot less stress knowing that everything is accounted for. So stop giving this myth space it doesn't deserve in your mind. Let's, put this notion of I can handle it, I can handle my money in my head to the side and get your numbers, get your budget out of your head and onto paper. Next budgeting myth to let go of, my parents didn't budget, so I can't budget. Have you ever thought to yourself, well, I didn't learn money from my parents, or my parents weren't good with money, my parents didn't budget, so I guess I can't budget either? First off, if you have those thoughts, you're not alone. But let me tell you, it's time to let go of this myth. First, you are not your parents. You can be better than them, and hopefully they would want that for you. Second, don't you want that for yourself? Don't you want to be better than your parents, especially if you found that your parents struggle with money? you don't want to stay the same, and that could potentially lead to your children staying the same, right? So if you continue this cycle that your parents started, it will continue with your kids and their kids. We want to break that cycle. So this belief that your ability to budget your money and manage it well is, being tied to what your parents did or didn't do with money is very common. It's so easy to see how this type of myth or thought can take root in your mind and just like hold its grip, because we are products of our environment. So it's definitely understandable to think this way, but this does not have to be the truth. This does not have to be the reality. There's no denying that many of our money habits come from what we saw growing up. So if your parents didn't budget or didn't budget well, it's natural to feel like you're stuck in that same cycle. I mean, that's all you saw. So therefore, that's all you know. But your past doesn't define your future. Just because your parents didn't budget doesn't mean you are not capable of budgeting or succeeding with budgeting. You just need to acknowledge the reality. Maybe you didn't have the best role models when it comes to money, but that doesn't mean that you can't change that narrative. So I've said this plenty of times on the podcast, but like any skill, budgeting can be learned and mastered. And it starts with accepting where you're at currently and then making a decision to move forward. So start by seeking out knowledge, whether that's through books, podcasts like this one, or working with a coach. With the right tools and mindset, you can create a future for your finances and for your money that just looks completely different from what you grew up with. So this particular myth, breaking free from it is just so empowering, and it really is just the beginning. You can change your narrative, but you can also change the narrative of future generations, and that's incredibly empowering. So I will also say that if your parents are still around and maybe they still struggle with budgeting, but they are open to learning, you can even help them improve, the final years of their life. It is never too late to get started with proper budgeting. The next myth that everyone should stop believing about budgeting is, I have to be good with numbers or math to create a budget. So raise your hand if you ever thought, well, I can't budget because I'm just not good with numbers. As a money coach, I've actually heard this more times than you would believe, but here's the good news. Budgeting actually has very little to do with math. So yes, there are numbers involved, there is math involved, but that doesn't have to be your responsibility. This myth that you need to be like a genius to create and stick to a budget is just completely based out of fear. So let's just break this down a bit. First off, it is very easy to feel intimidated by numbers, but budgeting does not require advanced calculations. In fact, if you pass third grade math, I think you're good to go. And why? Well, because most of the math can be done for you, whether that's with a calculator or a formula on a spreadsheet or even through your budgeting app. So when it comes to actually creating your budget, there are certain numbers that you do need to know and be aware of. And those numbers include your total take-home income. So whatever that looks like on a monthly basis, you do want to know that information. And if it's just one single source of income that you have, no additional math is required, right? If you do have multiple streams of income, yes, you'll need to total up your total take-home income. But again, a calculator or a formula on a spreadsheet will do the trick for you. The other numbers that you'll need to know are your total take-home expenses and spending. So this will require some math, again with a calculator or a formula, but just write out all of your expenses, add those all up, write up all of the things you spend your money on, add those totals up, and then subtract your total expenses and spending from your income. Boom, you've got your high-level budget, and it shouldn't have required much mental fatigue. If you're using a spreadsheet like Excel or Google Sheets, those things will even do the math for you. But if you prefer writing out your budget and numbers, a calculator, simple calculator on your phone will work just fine. Now, just kind of pulling the thread through a little bit more on this. Once you've subtracted your expenses from your income, you will see one of two things. First, you will see if you have a profit, meaning you actually have money left over after paying your bills and accounting for your normal spending. The other thing you may see is a deficit, meaning you are spending more than you make. So your income is not covering your total bills, expenses, and spending. And this could mean that you're probably using credit cards or constantly dipping into savings. So that's what you will see when you do this kind of high level budget calculation. Now, here is the best part about all of this. Once you've done those simple calculations, the real work of budgeting will actually begin. And the real work of budgeting has nothing to do with math. It's all about prioritizing your spending, making adjustments, and just setting goals and working towards those goals. So if you let the thought of, I can't budget because I'm not good with math or numbers hold you back, it's time to let all of that go. You do not need to be good with numbers. You just need to know your numbers, and then you can get to work. The next budgeting myth to completely let go of is a budget means I can't have fun or enjoy life. Let me guess. You've heard that a budget is the end of all fun, right? Or maybe you've just created this narrative in your head. You don't really actually have proof that a budget is a bad thing. Well, here's the truth. A budget doesn't mean you can't enjoy life, first and foremost. In fact, it's the opposite. And if you say that a budget means saying goodbye to fun or spontaneity or enjoying the things you love, that couldn't be further from the truth. I know I've said this plenty of times before on the podcast, but I got to say it again. A budget is simply a tool. It tells you three things: how much money is coming in, how much money is going out, and what's left over. That is it. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. Not to mention, if you don't like what that information is showing you, that's not really the budget's fault. The budget is simply bringing it to life. Okay? So if you feel like you can't have fun or enjoy yourself or do anything for yourself, it's probably because you either don't have a budget or you're just not using your budget as you should be. So a budget should include the things you love. It should include you saving for things that mean something to you. A budget lets you plan for fun and do so guilt-free. Now, you may not have all of the money in the world to spend on fun and things like that, but your budget will tell you what you can afford to spend on those things and not move backwards financially. So if you want to go out for drinks, see a concert, take a weekend trip, just make sure it's factored into your budget. Make sure you understand your limits and work towards it. Some things may require you to save month over month, like getting Beyonce tickets. That might take a while for you to save up and purchase, but your budget will tell you what you can afford to save for it. So it's not a matter of, a budget means I can't have fun. It's a matter of you being able to control your spending, stick to the limits of your budget, and be intentional with how you allocate your money to your priorities, but also to the things you love. Now, here's where I need to be real with you. The amount that you can budget for fun might not be what you want. I touched on this a little bit, but it's just the reality of our life. We live in this society where it costs money to survive. It costs money to do things. It costs money to reach our goals. So if you have financial priorities that you're working towards, you may not be able to do all of the fun things you want to do. But just know something is better than nothing. I bought myself an iced coffee today and it was budgeted for. I might not be able to go on a shopping spree because that's not in my budget, but I can work towards that. So the key is moderation. Know what you can afford to spend on fun and stick to that number, even if it means saving for a couple of months so that you can take that big trip or go see that concert. So be it. A budget gives you the control to do that, not necessarily restrictions. So Yes, you can absolutely have fun and enjoy life on a budget. All right, let's get into the final budgeting myth to let go of. And that myth is I can't ever go over my budget. So, if you have ever thought to yourself, well, if I go over my budget, I've failed, I want to set the record straight because life happens and going over budget really is not the end of the world. I mean, I'm a money coach who specializes in budgeting and I go over budget sometimes. And that's because nobody is perfect. Things come up, stuff will happen, impulses can take over. So many things play a role here. But this unrealistic idea that you can never go over your budget is what's keeping you from being successful with budgeting. And the truth is that life is unpredictable, and so is your spending at times. You cannot predict the future. We cannot plan for everything. Maybe your car breaks down, or you get a surprise medical bill, or maybe you come into extra money that you weren't planning on. So, a lot of these things can impact your budget one way or another, and that's okay. That's life. Saying you'll never go over budget just isn't realistic. So it's very important to break through this myth or this belief that you may have because it will always feel like you're failing if you don't. And I do want to say that going over budget doesn't mean you failed. And it also doesn't mean that you should throw your budget out the window for the month, especially when things don't go as planned. I think you should instead look at your budget as this flexible guide that will adapt and change as your life changes. So, taking the approach of bouncing back when things throw your budget off is really what's going to keep you on track. And you can also focus on being proactive instead of reactive. So, here are a few just quick tips that can help you prepare for unexpected things. I think the first one is to review your past spending. So, if you're new to budgeting or you're getting a new budgeting system set up, this will be really helpful. Review your past spending. So, look at your bank and credit card statements to just account for all of your recurring and irregular expenses. So, try to pinpoint things that came up that you weren't planning for, that you weren't aware of. And maybe you'll find a pattern or something that you had previously missed before, and you can use that information to adjust your next month's budget. Another thing you can do is plan for the unplanned. And I've talked about this on the podcast before, but you can set aside a small amount of money each paycheck for just unexpected expenses. And if nothing comes up, move that money into savings. Over time, you can grow like a short-term emergency fund or just a savings for things that you want to do. And you'll have the peace of mind of knowing that if something does come up, you are at least covered. So remember, it is okay to go over budget sometimes, as long as you're prepared for it and you can keep moving forward and bounce back with grace. So there you have it. I have just walked through 5 of the most common budgeting myths that millennial women or women in general, people everywhere need to stop believing. And I hope that this has shown you that a budget really isn't bad. In fact, a budget is really good. So if you are ready to get past your negative mindset about budgeting and create a solid, impactful budget for yourself, I want to help. I actually create budget plans for clients. So if the thought of creating your own budget terrifies you, let me create one for you. I will drop the link to that in the show notes so that we can get started.